Hey, it's Rachel. I am at the future Permaculture lot to talk through the next step in the design process of turning this kind of hot mess behind me into a permaculture site in the suburbs. This video is going to be focused on Zone 1, specifically the vegetable garden that's going to be there. Believe it or not, this pile of dirt over here, over my shoulder, is where that garden is going to eventually be. I want to talk through what I'm growing, what is going to go in each bed with the detailed layouts drawn to scale, and how I'm going to make it all work together in a crop rotation system and hopefully include my chickens. If I get approved, if I get my exemption, maybe even if I don't, they might become civil disobedience chickens. But with any luck, I will have my chickens and they can be part of this rotation. So I'm also going to talk at the very end about how I'm going to work them into this. In my first design video, I talked about using the permaculture concept of zones of use to lay out our lot, in which you take the elements that you interact with most often and place them near your house, and the ones that don't require much interaction are further away. In my resulting design, Zone 1, close to the house, includes a garden with raised beds where I will be growing most of our food crops. This is enclosed with a fence to keep out deer. In fact, you might be able to see a deer behind me. There's a bunch of them over here on the edge of the lot. They're here all the time. So this does need to be fenced in, and fencing is expensive. Even though we have the land, I am still going to try and make as much efficient use of the space as I possibly can to minimize the amount of fencing that I need to build. I decided to put in a total of 12 beds to give me room for what I want to grow. These are 4 feet by 8 feet for efficient use of dimensional lumber with 3-foot walkways in between them. Because I use high-density planting, I will need to amend the soil often with fresh compost, and I'm putting the chicken coop near the garden to make it easy to harvest that compost. I'll go into the details of that design in the Zone 2 video, but for now, just note that it has an integrated compost run using the deep litter method, which runs along the west and also down the middle of that coop. And then on the north and south edges, those are lined with a total of 6 interior compost bins. I left a 4-foot walkway between the coop and the beds for better wheelbarrow movement as I move that compost around. The whole thing, as mentioned, needs a tall deer-proof fence around it. That's going to open towards the house, and I've also left 3 feet of walkway between the beds and that fence. We eat a lot of berries, and they'll also need deer protection and bird protection. So in the northwest corner here, I am putting in a mini orchard of sorts with peninsula-style beds full of perennial berry plants like raspberries, blackberries, blueberries, maybe honeyberries. Those extend down like fingers with a 2-foot access aisle in between them. Now down at the east end, I did leave a 4-foot aisle of access to make sure that wheelbarrows again can get in and out of the coop. Going along the north fence, I have placed another perennial bed with asparagus, and that would be underplanted with strawberries. Last, and probably most ambitiously, I'm going to try my hand at growing espaliered fruit trees, and I'm planning to do 2 apple trees, so 2 different types that can pollinate each other in the northwest, and 2 pear trees similarly espaliered in the northeast corner of that asparagus and strawberry bed. Let's talk in detail about those 12 beds and what's going to go in them. If you've seen most of my other videos, you know I do have multiple sclerosis, and I use diet, specifically the Walls protocol, to manage that. It means eating as much fresh, nutritious, vegetable-based food as I possibly can year-round. And with the Walls protocol, I specifically focus on leafy greens, sulfur-rich vegetables, and colorful vegetables, as well as fruits. That means my goal overall is to get as many of those as I can out of the garden 4 seasons of the year, including the winter. And my plan is to use some cold frames on top of the beds to still harvest things and eat fresh as much as I can through the winter. Here is what I'm planning to grow. So what I grow is very different than what other people might grow, but I'll walk you through my logic and why it works for our family. I do try and emphasize things that check multiple boxes in the Walls protocol. I've put that diagram back here on the right, so you can see things like kale, arugula, beet greens, purple broccoli, things like that are really good for me. They're very versatile. They check a lot of boxes. And then you'll see some of these quantities probably look insane. That's because I am going to try this year, as my garden has gotten larger and I have the room, to preserve things. So as an example, I love spinach. I eat it as a salad green fresh, but I also use it in soups and smoothies. So if I can grow a ton of spinach, I will be able to blanch that, freeze that, use it for the rest of the year. Similarly with the peppers, they're very expensive at the store, so you're thinking, my God, why is this woman growing 60 peppers? It's because I'm going to try and slice them up and use them through the rest of the year. We do buy a lot of them, and it's, again, pretty pricey. Same deal with tomatoes. I use a lot of tomato puree, and so I've got 24 tomatoes. 4 of those are just for fresh eating. 20 of them will be paste types that I can puree and store and save for the rest of the year. I know that sounds like a lot of plants, and it is. I'm probably planting too much, we'll see. And it might seem like it'd be hard to figure out a rotation system, but it's really not. I have a pretty simple thing I've been doing for a while. I did an earlier video on it, which is I take my gardening beds and I divide them in 2. Half of them are spring/fall beds. I'll try and show a graphic of that here. Those get spring crops, a buckwheat cover crop in between, and then fall crops, and then they sit vacant for the winter. The other half of the beds become summer/winter beds, and I'll show that diagram here. Those are planted in the summer with more of my fruiting crops. They get a fall cover crop in between, followed by wintered and overwintering crops that stay in the beds through the winter. The following year, they flip to a spring and fall bed, and then back to a summer and winter bed. This means because I am growing different plant families in the spring and fall than I am in the summers, I tend to get a decent crop rotation just by flipping the bed types every year. Moving to the detailed bed layout diagrams, as a reminder, these are 4 feet by 8 feet, and I've drawn them here to scale. I've also drawn in the center lines, just in case you find that useful when you're doing your own gardening layouts. Hopefully you can get a sense of the detailed spacing and draw this according to your own scale. I'll start with the spring-fall beds and show the brassicas first. I grow these plants under row cover to protect from cabbage moths. I have a whole other video about that. So for me, it makes the most sense to group them all together and cover the whole bed. This is kind of the opposite of my normal approach of trying to plant polycultures, but it's just a practical thing. Shown here, I can fit 11 kale plants into a single bed. That's enough for my family at any given time, so I'm just going to do 1 bed of kale. And then the broccoli plants also grow under row cover, but they need more room. I can fit 8 of those in a bed as shown here, and I've reserved 2 beds for broccoli so I can get 16 plants at any time. The remaining 3 spring/fall beds have plants that are mostly in the beet family. My 5 chard plants take half of 1 bed, and then the other half of that bed is reserved for some 4-foot planting strips of arugula, beets, and radish. I've got 2 rows each of those. And then down the center is where I can plant some carrots in the fall especially. That's the hardest part of the bed to reach, and since carrots just sit there for a long time in the soil, it's a good place to put them. And then the last 2 spring/fall beds are completely planted out with spinach. I'm showing that here. It's also a member of the beet family. Those go 6 inches on center, and it can yield a total for me of 140 plants. Now for the 6 summer/winter beds, I only have 1 layout. It's a lot simpler. And I try and mix as many plant families around as I can in both of those layouts to help, again, with crop rotation and not putting any particular nutrient strains on the soil or encouraging any particular pest or disease. In the summer, I will run a trellis down the center of the bed as shown here with the little dashed line. That can hold 4 tomato plants for a total of 24 across all of the beds. That takes up about a little bit more than half of the trellis. And then the other end of the trellis will get 1 melon plant. That might be a watermelon or a spaghetti squash. I can fit 2 zucchini squash in half of a bed. Those are the same plant family as the melon, so you can see I've put them here down at the tomato end of the trellis. The other end of the bed, near the melon, is planted very densely with a mix of peppers and bean plants on 1-foot centers. The beans need to be picked frequently to keep producing, so I've put them towards the edges of the beds for easy access, and then the peppers take up the rest of that space. Peppers are in the same Solanaceae family as the tomatoes, so kind of like the melons and the squash, I want to get these at least on opposite ends of the bed to help a little bit with demands on the soil, nutrients, and with disease. Note that all of these are fruiting crops and they need pollination to set fruit, so I've included several pollinator plants shown here with these purple asterisks to help attract our friendly local pollinators. Last layout is my winter beds. I mentioned I'm going to put a cold frame on these. I'm going to show here, it's important to remember that that is a sloping lid. The north edge of the bed will be much taller than the south end of the bed. The reason is that slope helps us with snow accumulation and helping to scrape that off or get it to slide off on its own. It also helps with capturing the maximum amount of sunlight. I am in the northern hemisphere and my sun will come from the south. So having a lid that slopes up and away from the south edge means that you can capture as much sunlight as possible. As I look at the layout here, this means that I need to think about plant height. I place my tallest plants, which for me are going to be winter boar kales, along the north edge. I'll then tuck some spinach plant in at the base of those to the south of the kale. I've got room for a couple 4-foot rows of beet greens to the south of that, and then another row of spinach. This bottom little strip here, I'm going to leave blank. This is because the late fall and winter sun is at a very low angle, and this portion of the bed is likely to be in almost constant shade, given the raised wood edges of the bed. This means it'll tend to stay really wet and cold, and I'd rather not try and force plants to be successful in those conditions. One last diagram showing how all of this comes together with an example bed going through a 2-year rotation. There's a lot going on here, but just start at the top right. You can see I'm hoping to use the chickens as a cleaning crew. So they're going to come in for a week-long field trip into one bed and be contained there so they can add their droppings and consume or scratch up any remaining plant debris. And in the case like here at the top, where they're following a silage tarp, they should also get the joy of eating some worms that have been brought to the surface. So it's also a handy addition to their diet. As we follow along here in the bed, it would then be planted with either the brassica or the beet family. Spring-fall layout, noted here as kind of type A or type B. As we head towards summer and things start to bolt, the chickens can come back through again and clean out the crop residue. I can plant a quick buckwheat cover crop to add organic matter and support pollinators, and then bring those chickens back in as a cleaning crew to take that out before putting in the fall crop. Now, if the bed had brassicas in the spring, it would get beets now. If it had beets in the spring, it would get brassicas now. And I would then work in one more chicken clean out after the fall crops and add some fresh compost on top, cover that with a layer of fall leaves, and the whole thing with a silage tarp, and leave it there until the following summer. So as we move into the summer of year 2, the summer plants go into the bed, one more chicken field trip to clean those out, and then that gets a fall forage blend cover crop planted under the summer beds. The idea here is that I can have a mix of oilseed radish, some clover, some alfalfa, things like flax. Those can come up, a nice little polyculture blend of different plant families, add organic matter to the soil, and then also be a really wonderful treat for the chickens when they come in and clean that out for a week at the end. That puts the bed into good shape to get my winter crops in there. They can start to establish, and if it starts getting cold, I can cover them up with the cold frame lids. You can kind of see I now move over back to the right circle, and once those are spent or totally harvested, I'm not going to send the chickens back in because it's really cold and muddy and weird. I'm just going to cover it up with a silage tarp for a couple of weeks to try and warm back up the soil, and then I'll bring the chickens in after that, and as they dig for bugs, they can hopefully prep the bed. We are now back into year 3, and it once again becomes a spring-fall bed, and the cycle repeats. So there you go. That is the full overall design, detailed bed layouts, planting plans, and rotation systems, including the ambitious chicken piece of it for next year. So I may not get this built in time for my spring crops, given the current state of what's going on here, but I am pretty sure we'll have it in place at least for summer, and I can get half the beds in with my summer crops, half of them get my fall, and then we're off to the races. I'd love to hear what people are growing for next year, how you're thinking about rotations and that, especially if you're doing any kind of permaculture inspired design yourself. Please post, and we can hopefully learn from each other as a community. The next video will be about Zone 2, mostly the chicken coop, and I am definitely going to look for feedback from anybody that has ever done this, because I have never designed a chicken coop before, and my whole idea might be crazy. So look for that Zone 2 video next, and until then, I hope this was helpful. Thanks.